All right. I am Jason Truding of the So Percussion, and this is another Brooklyn Bound podcast. I'm super pumped. This is the second one we're doing leading up to our October 8th show and talking with Elijah Smith. Elijah, what's up?
How's it going?
I actually usually before I press record, I make sure that I'm pronouncing names right. Is it in fact Elijah Smith?
Smith is actually pronounced different. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking. I'm terrible about correcting people with my last name. I'm just gonna say it, Jason Truding. Oh, I think I did. Yeah, yeah. I'm terrible when people say Troyding. I don't correct them because it's kind of, and then it's like years later, when you drop, they're like, it's actually Smythe. Like, well, cool, man. We're actually both in Princeton right now, which is
Yeah,
is amazing, and I haven't seen you yet. We're gonna fix that.
yeah,
I was telling you, I think I bike by your house often, so I'll figure that
yeah,
out. But we are pumped that your music's going to be on Brooklyn Bound. Thanks for having
yeah.
this
Me too.
conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Of
So
course.
I was telling you, I kind of sort of do the same five questions, and the first one I can ask and then just sit back and relax and take it in. Um, so how are you the musician you are today? No, I'm just joking. like when did you discover your musical path? Like what? I don't actually know your musical path that well. I'm gathering you write music. I'm gathering you're a drummer on some level because
Um,
um no?
yeah, not quite. No, no. Yeah,
In like some of the music we've done together, you talked very
yeah,
specifically about the gravity blasts and stuff.
yeah, yeah.
Um
Yeah. It's been like a bit of a long, winding path, but I'll truncate it. But essentially, when I was a little kid, like 4 or 5 or something like that, there was always a piano in our house because my mom plays piano. So she got me started with piano lessons when I was young, and I hated them. So after like 6 months, I quit. But I kept like you know fooling around at the piano for a while, and then the first sort of like significant musical experience that I think I had, I was I think like 10, and my older sister, who was a violinist at the time, she showed me a music video for this metal band named Trivium, and I fell in love. And so at that moment, I was like, I'm like 10 years old, and
yeah,
I was like, I want to play guitar and scream in a metal band. And my mom and my dad were like, okay. But so they
sounds
supported
great.
it, and yeah, so
Yeah.
they got me a guitar and they put me in some guitar lessons, and they eventually put me in School of Rock in Chicago, and I met some, folks there, and we formed a little metal band and all that kind of stuff. And I played in that for a while. And when high school came around, my mom had recognized that, hey, you're screaming a lot. You're going to ruin your voice.
Mm.
So she put me in voice lessons because she had better foresight than I did. And essentially, when high school came around, I wanted to transfer to this brand new performing arts high school in Chicago called Shy Arts. And I wanted to transfer for guitar, but they didn't have any openings. So my mom was like, just audition on voice, see what happens. So I did, and I think I sang like Bill Withers and Stevie Wonder, and I got in, and then I
Amazing.
realized, like, yeah, like first day, I realized like this is a classical voice program. I
Yeah.
was like, I don't know anything about this. I was just like, so I'm sitting there, I was like, I have no idea what's going on. I couldn't really read music yet, and I was just, I felt like a fish out of water. But I just transferred there, so it's not like I was about to be like, nope, never mind.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so I stuck with it, and kept sort of like writing, songs for my band and everything like that. And then once that band split up, I was like, well, maybe I should try my hand at this, seeing as I've been studying classical voice for the last 3 years. Maybe I should actually give it a shot. So I did. And around that time, my one of my teachers, who was really influential, he in my life, he ended up giving me a copy of Sibelius 4. And that was sort of like my first time trying to write stuff that was actually supposed to be notated. And That's kind of how I got into composition. I went to University of Illinois for voice for a year and realized it wasn't really what I wanted to do. So once again, I transferred to the Boston Conservatory for composition with the intention of doing film scores. I graduated, went out to LA to work in that industry, realized it wasn't really for me, and then I decided to just go full steam ahead in the sort of contemporary classical world. And I went back to get my master's at Peabody in Baltimore, and then I got into Princeton, and now I'm here. So
Man, you did
yeah.
an amazing. That was an amazingly good Cliff Note version. I want to go back to this moment. I'm trying to imagine, like, so this was high school that you did that at the Bill Withers, Stevie Wonder.
Yeah, Yeah.
Like, it feels like a little bit like it's some of that's on the other side, right? Some of that's on the auditioners, right? Like I'm imagining showing up in high school and doing my like double bass, like, and then being like, you're it. And then you
Yeah.
show up the next day and you're in an orchestra. You're like, this is not what I auditioned
Yeah,
for.
yeah, exactly.
Like,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And I think like I have no idea what the criteria was for letting me into the program. I mean, I think like just on a whim, I was like, I should probably look nice. So, I wore like concert blacks and everything like that, which I look like I'm wearing right now anyway. But
Yeah.
anyway, I, I looked presentable and everything. And I think, for a 14-year-old, that was probably like, what their expectations were. So, yeah, so once I got in, I was just like, oh wow. And I have no idea. Like I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for that conversation of like, he has no idea what this program is,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
let's let him in anyway.
I kind of love that. I mean, happy ending, I suppose. It feels like you're happy doing what you're doing now. So hopefully that's a
Yeah.
happy. So my two follow-up questions before we move on. Have you been wearing black ever since then? And were you playing with the same metal band since 10? Like, when was it one band from when you were 10?
uh yeah, kind of. There's like a band that I played in, like we were like 11, so we didn't really do anything ever at all.
Right.
But then like when I sort of got closer to high school. Well, to answer your first question, yes, I pretty much am wearing
That's
all black
okay.
for a while now. I like to wear some nice summery looking stuff in the summer, but technically it's fall now, so
So you're good.
yeah. But when I got into, or there was a second band that I started playing in, I was like 13, and we played until I was like 16 or 17, I think. And we actually like, played shows and recorded some songs and all that kind of stuff and demos. Can't find them online, shame, right? But
You sure?
yeah, I'm pretty sure. Don't
Fairly
don't don't
popular,
go
yeah.
don't go digging
Man, we
too
have a
hard.
great in our band, and so Eric. I mean, all of us have some story of. I mean, much before you, but because I didn't recognize the metal band that you threw out there when you Tovium. Is that what is that?
Trivium.
It would have been Metallica and Iron Maiden and those like
Yeah.
those names were but all of us have some story of that playing. But Eric's like was pretty good and they made recordings of which still exist a bit and maybe I'll find a way to send you it. Unfortunately sounds better than I wish it did because it'd be easier to kind of like make fun. It's like, oh, that actually sounds pretty, that's like a good high school garage band, like they're kind of killing. um but so does that then you studied Illinois, quickly moved to Boca.
Boston
Is that Boston
Conservatory. Yeah,
Conservatory?
Boca. Yeah.
Very cool. And was that so? How has your practice been? I know your music some through hanging
Yeah.
over the summer bit, virtually, and hanging out in Princeton virtually. But like your music is, how much did that metal background, singing background, guitar background, and then the like Sibelius 4, how much have those been kept separate? And I can imagine by Peabody, I would imagine just knowing Oscar, and I would imagine some that could have been, or at Princeton, I think people definitely
Yeah.
are looking to bring those passions together. How much were they separate, and how much were they?
They were very separate for a while actually. And to a degree they still kind of are. I do like I guess like indie rock stuff on the side, where I sort of just throw all that stuff in there. But I think the metal influence I think sticks with me more than the rest. I think being a singer for a while, it sort of changed the way I think about just like physically experiencing music in general. But I don't actively think about that sort of stuff when I'm writing. Um, but with metal, there's a certain like intensity to it that I've always been drawn to, and I think that's what I was really drawn to when I was a kid. Is that it was just like no holds barred, just like go for it and do your thing. And I think I still there's still a lot of that in my music. I know like one of the things that I worked on the most at Peabody was just committing to an idea and just saying like whatever, like just go for it. And the string quartet that I wrote called Submergences was sort of like my first endeavor into just saying like I'm just going to commit to this idea and I'm just going to go with it. And it ended up being like 20 minutes of just like really intense sound.
Awesome.
And then also the piece that's going to be on Brooklyn Bound, with the metal influences, like some of my favorite metal bands are bands like August Burns Red, and Sugar. and This or the Apocalypse, and they all have this like really interesting and Animals as Leaders, but they all have like this really fun thing that they do where it's just like a lot of the time like you can hear the pulse and you can feel the beat, but you have no idea where the actual like phrase starts and ends. And I've always found that really interesting. You sort of have this rhythmic experience where I'm just kind of like, I have no idea where I am. I'm pumped about it because this
Mm.
is awesome, but I have no idea where in the phrase I am. And I think that's something that, in terms of like my rhythmic language, is something that really stuck with me. Where it's just kind of like you are kind of lost in this sea of.
Is that because the phrases just go so long, or like are they overlapping in some way? Is that a way to think, or like how does that?
Yeah, I think
I
a
don't know.
lot of the time like they're overlapping, and a lot of the time it's they're meters where everybody but the drummer is playing in one
Mm.
meter, and it's just like um there's a song by Animals as Leaders called Tempting Time, where it starts out and it's like in 5 or 4, where like the actual melody is 5/4 and the drums are playing in 4/4, and it's
Mm.
just kind of like the first time I heard it I was like, I have no idea what's going on. I was like,
Yeah,
this
yeah,
sounds
right.
awesome, but
Yeah.
um so that's something that I think in terms of those influences really stuck with me more than most, just because the intensity is something that I've always loved, and just sort of having to really listen to kind of be like, what is going on. So the piece that's going to be on Brooklyn Bound, I kind of really wanted to and sort of embrace that and go hard with that idea.
And I love, I mean, what you said about, I feel like you just distilled all of music making into this great, like just the like committing to something. Like I just feel like commitment or intention or like those words or something that just like come back to me so much in terms of like the music I make and also just like working with other folks and teaching and stuff. It just feels like distilling that like just commit to something, and see it through, and I can
Yeah,
see how like with the like Meshuggah or what, I don't know the other band, Animals as Leader, is that what you're saying?
yeah. Animals as Leaders.
Yeah.
Led by a guitarist
Like I
named
can see
Tosin
how
Tabasi.
those like on the
Unbelievable.
surface there's that feeling of just like such direct commitment. I feel
Yeah,
like most music probably that we all know and love have that characteristic of commitment to them,
yeah,
you know what I mean?
yeah.
Um so but I want to hear more about the Brooklyn Bound piece, but right before we get there, like what I guess, so the piece on Brooklyn Bound, it's a quartet.
Yeah.
Yeah. um you don't only write percussion quartets. Like how much have you written for percussion, and what else are you doing that you're kind of pumped about before we get to this Brooklyn Bound set?
Um, that I think was that I'll call that the first piece that I ever wrote for percussion. Like I did some student stuff at Boco, but like I would never want to listen to that ever in my life.
Did you
But
work, when
so
were you at Boca? Did you work with my friend Doug Perkins worked there?
yeah,
uh,
I know I was there at the same time, but I don't think we ever worked together. I was there from 2014 to 2017.
cool.
Um, but this was sort of like my first real endeavor into writing for percussion. In well, chamber percussion.
Right.
And it it was a real challenge just because I think a lot of the music that I write is I've focused a lot on texture and timbre and harmony and pitch. And writing something that had no pitch was a way to sort of force me to think about um, just sound differently and work with musical materials that I would typically not necessarily neglect, but they wouldn't be my primary focus.
Mm.
So working with unpitched percussion, unpitched, and sort of getting into this headspace of like, okay, how can I interact with these sonic materials, and how can I actually make this interesting in a way that I think is sort of, I guess, playing off the same concepts that I think about with pitch, but without pitch, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And so what, I'm totally interested in that, because to me, um like I write music as well, and I would say for me, I've never felt like pitch and harmony have been like some um super fundamental thing, and like that's not what I offer the world. As a composer, I offer other things. I have a pretty basic sense of where my kind of harmonic palette deals, but writing music without any pitches is still really difficult for me, even when it's not the most important thing to me, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I know it's been really fun actually to work with folks through Soci or at Princeton, where you kind of start to think about that, like how do you organize music without pitch when that's been a fundamental. So what are the similarities in terms of like the, like the string quartet you were talking about, like
Mm.
um what are the things that feel like a through line between those two pieces, the percussion quartet and string quartet, and what are like totally, different?
Yeah. Um, I mean, with the string quartet is, thinking a lot about sort of the intersection of harmony and texture and thinking about how those two things are related and what can I do with that and how can I sort of separate those and keep them together at the same time, if that makes sense. But with the percussion quartet, it was, um, I think I just sort of like still thinking about texture and timbre, but in that case, the materials that I was using, they weren't necessarily sustaining instruments like a string instrument is. So all of a sudden, the approach to texture is totally different because you can't, I can have a chord just sustain in a string quartet, and all of a sudden there you go, you get a texture. But if it, I feel like with writing for percussion quartet, if I want a dense texture like that, it has to be a much more active thing.
Yeah,
Um, so I my first attempt at writing it was like, let's make this really dense texture that's sort of similar to that. And then I realized like that's just like, why am I trying to turn this percussion quartet into a string quartet? It's just not what it is. So then that's when I started thinking more about, like rhythmic cycles and some of the things that I was talking about with metal and thinking about the way in which I can organize these rhythms and lead the ear to an aspect of the music that I typically wouldn't say is the strongest suit in my music that has pitch and harmony. So with the percussion quartet, I think there are a lot of similarities in the sense that I'm, it's four voices and sort of dealing with, because I recently wrote the percussion quartet actually for empty alcohol bottles. And COVID hit right before I actually got to have the piece performed, and it's kind of a blessing in disguise. Not COVID, it's not a blessing in disguise at all.
yeah,
But
yeah.
not having the piece, not having, not having the piece performed
That's really
was.
good. I wasn't that way, but that was also a really quick catch. Like, no, just for the record. Yeah. Wait, but so
Yeah,
you'd written that piece for folks in Baltimore, or you'd written that piece to happen at SOC?
I wrote that piece originally for some folks in Baltimore at Peabody, for their percussion department, and it would have worked. Like like I had all the alcohol bottles that they were going to use, so it would have been fine. But once COVID hit and the piece wasn't going to be performed anymore, I was like, all right, well, that piece is going to have to change shape in some capacity if I want to have it performed again. And that's essentially what happened with Soci, because first, I was like, well, I'm not going to have these players all go out and buy multiple bottles of hard liquor and then down that in 24 hours to play the piece or pour it out. It's just a waste of money. So
Thoughtful of you. That's thoughtful.
thank you. Yeah. But so I figured just having it for, so originally when I wrote it for those bottles, I was thinking about it as like a relatively homogenous sounding ensemble, similar to string quartet. And I think there is a similarity in that where it's just like four of these things that can sound the same or different depending on how you treat it. But essentially, once it was going to be done at Soci, I was like, all right, well, I have no idea what these people are going to have, so let's just have them do whatever they want and find something that fits these parameters, and maybe it'll sound really cool, maybe it won't, but it ended up sounding really cool, so that's great.
I love that. I want to ask you more about it, but for context, though, I imagine everybody who would be watching this knows about SOCI. SOCI is short for Percussion Summer Institute, and we do it every year. And one of the awesome things is that composers from Princeton, the first concert, usually Elijah, next year when it's in Princeton, the middle Saturday is always premieres of Princeton composer pieces, which is just, it's awesome music, awesome, the students spend so much time on it. It's like a really amazing concert. This year we did some similar things, but it was all remote, right? The world has gone remote, so in some ways I liked the limitation of, you were having to write music for things that everybody could find in their houses. I imagine this piece is written, and I hope it's written in a way that it definitely worked remotely, but I imagine it's written in a way that it can happen live in a concert hall in the future too. Yeah. But so what was what was the openness in the instrumentation? Were there, like, did you kind of describe the sound, like dry sounds or bright sounds or that kind of thing?
I think I don't remember my exact language in the actual score, but I basically said that each player needs to have three dry sounding instruments that they just hit, and then they need to have one very resonant sounding instrument that they also hit, but that just to sort of have that contrast. And I originally wrote the piece with that in mind, where I had the glass bottles, but then everybody also had a metal mixing bowl as well with various amounts of water in them. But then sort of thinking about like, okay, well, how can I sort of keep those same characteristics that I had for those for the bottles and the bowls, but then have it also work and make it open-ended enough that these people could find these things in their homes, but also specific enough that it's just as little time needs to be spent figuring out like what do you mean by this. So
Right. So like in theory, it could work for those three glass bottles of liquor and a mixing bowl, but it could work for, you know, I could make my drums dry and hit a cymbal.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
in theory, it would work the same thing. This is you're gonna the more we get to know each other, you're gonna learn that this is just I have infinite. I could talk about this kind of idea forever. So could it work for a string quartet in terms of like if the cellist could find three different sounds on their cello and bow a long sound?
Yeah,
Could it work
yeah,
like
it could. I think it absolutely could. I think it'd be an interesting thing because then if they were to bow a long sound, you'd now be introducing definite pitch in a way that you
right,
wouldn't with the struck object. But I mean, hypothetically speaking, if all the instruments chose the same note or something like that, they could absolutely do it where you have
right?
the dry sounds just striking it and then something else. So
Well,
and I
could
wanted
it
to leave it.
work if you? No, no, sorry. I love this idea. I'm so happy you said yes. I was ready. I was ready to get to the no. I find it so interesting, and it may be that just this has been on your mind for a while because it sounds like the piece you were writing in the spring before COVID hit was in the world of openness. Um,
Yeah,
I just find it infinitely kind of interesting to question along the way composing a piece, like what has to be set and what can be open, you know,
yeah.
all from the standpoint of like, ideas of control and openness or as like what the composer controls is so it's an interesting thing to think about, and then just
Yeah,
practically like
yeah.
how the music can live is a really interesting and nice thing to think about.
Yeah, especially when it comes to, like you said, like the word control, like that's something that sort of relinquishing control is something that I've had to work really hard with. Because I'm really, in most of the music that I write, I'm really detailed about how everything is done and, all that kind of stuff. But with this, it's just kind of like, all right, well, I can't do that right now. And that might actually end up being a really good thing.
Mm,
And I think with this piece, it was just because I think, especially with percussionists, if I can say so, I think you value freedom in your playing more than a lot of other instrumentalists do, and that sort of creativity. I figure if I'm going to be working with a percussion quartet, you know more about hitting things than I do, and you've probably hit more things than I have. So you're probably going to have
right,
some more interesting ideas about like, oh, this is a crazy sound that you probably have never heard before because I just made it in my bathroom 20 minutes ago, and it's super
right.
sweet. Not that kind of bathroom sound, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
I think I know what you mean. Hitting the toilet bowl more than yeah.
yeah,
No, I think that's so. I'm glad it was a good experience for you. I find that too. I mean, I had this really memorable experience for myself where some friends were in town. Actually, a percussion quartet that's semi-based in Princeton called Mobius was playing a piece of mine. Um, and a great friend of mine, you may know Rob Hansen. He was in Boston for a while. I don't know, a
I think so.
composer, really really nice guy. He was at the show, and I remember he came up to me, and whenever there's like a I don't think like this anymore. I used to think of like, the like composer with a capital C in the room as opposed to me who's a performer that writes music, like that idea.
Yeah.
And Rob was like, man, like you got to tell me about how you orchestrated that piece. That's amazing. And it was just kind of awesome and embarrassing to say like, they chose all the sounds. You know what I mean? It's like, and if you heard another group play it, it could sound totally different. But I'm very intrigued by
Yeah.
that. So, but this performance, it was awesome that it was premiered at our Soci Marathon. But since it was premiered in a way that I had my earbuds in and had an awesome sonic experience there. But for this show in Brooklyn Bound, you have a new video happening. Tell me about that.
Yeah. It's the video was put together by the team of people at Soci. I originally was going to put it together myself, and my laptop was like, nope, you're not doing
Yeah.
that. So a bunch of people stepped in and helped out quite a bit. But I think that was another aspect where I tried to relinquish as much control as possible on the video as well, just because I think one of the things that is really interesting about percussion quartet that I felt as though there were some similarities to playing in a band, more so than with a lot of other ensembles, just because I think for a lot of percussionists the relationship with music in general is a bit different. So with that being the case, is just kind of like like what do you the people who are making the videos are sort of like what do you think is interesting in this capacity, because I'm interested to see that and I'm interested to see what you come up with. So I can't really um speak all that much to this is what we were trying to do with the video, because I was just kind of like I can't do anything helpful right now at all. So
What can you do? But I love the question. I was talking with somebody else who recently said this. It was actually, I was talking with Josh, to his old teacher, um, and he had said, like, just the act of in a rehearsal or in a collaboration, just being like, what do you think, or what do you want to do? That feels like such a natural thing in the scenes that I'm a part of, and I imagine you too. That feels like that's a natural thing to ask,
yeah,
But he was just commenting how that hasn't always been a natural thing for a composer or a collaborator to ask, right? It's been more about telling and less about like,
yeah,
what do you think, or what could you bring to this vibe, or what can
yeah. And I think a lot of that probably comes from this. I mean, there are a lot of things to talk about in terms of the culture of classical music and contemporary classical music and where that comes from, and the good parts and bad parts. But I think a lot of that comes from this, in my opinion, antiquated idea that the composer should be this omniscient person when it comes to their music, and it's just like, why? I
yeah,
mean, so I think with a lot of the music that I write, I have a very specific idea of what I'm looking for, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a lot of room for conversation and discussion, and people are always going to think of things that I don't think of. So I think it's always interesting, especially with this sort of stuff, to be like, what do you think? Because
yeah,
I have no idea what to do here. So,
yeah,
and it takes pressure off me as well, because then if it doesn't go well, I can think, oh, this person. No, I'm just kidding.
yeah, yeah. It's on them, they did it. Yeah. Well,
But
no, I'm pumped. I'm very, very pumped. I mean, one of the coolest things for me about Soci was actually seeing, like, not only what the audio came together for different pieces, but how creative some of the videos were. Um,
yeah,
for myself, have a very basic sense of the way I would present my music through video online right now. A lot of
yeah,
other folks had much, deeper sense of how to do that. Yeah, which I kind of find awesome. Um,
yeah.
I'd love to have the longer conversation about the state of the classical music world, um, which we will. We got time
Yeah, what are you
in
doing
our
for the next
lives. We got
24
time.
hours? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Um, but the next question, to orient you, there's been three questions so far. They've kind
Okay,
of bled
cool. I
into
didn't know
one.
where I was in this
That's where
nebulous
we were
world of
at. We were in, like,
conversation.
um, the first question was, what did you audition on when what did you sing to get into the classical program of Chayars? Um, no, but now, now I feel like, I mean, actually just the idea that we have met only over Zoom, you know, um, that music is being made in that way because we're in a crazy COVID landscape. Concerts are happening online, which I'm grateful for on some level, but I don't need to be the way that life is for the rest of like I'm eager to hear your piece in a room with you. Um, and then, I think after months of COVID vibe, um, Black Lives Matter moment and Black Lives Matter movement being not new, but a new consciousness to the way it's being talked about, at least in the circles that I'm a part of. Uh, Taken years, I think, to be talked about in that way from when the movement first started, but the fact that it is being talked about in a different way. Um, I mean, to me, just I think I don't know what the question is exactly, but the conversation in these podcasts has been a little bit just like being an artist or being a composer in this moment. Um, is that has that changed your practice, or have these things? Is this something you have thought about in terms of why am I doing what I'm doing and how am I doing it, or has it, yeah, I guess, how has it changed your mindset?
Yeah. I mean, COVID actually absolutely has, but also in a way, I think COVID has sort of inspired me to do something that I've always kind of wanted to do, and now I've had more of an opportunity to do it, in the sense that I didn't grow up listening to music in a concert hall. I didn't grow up listening to live music. I grew up listening to music in headphones and watching music videos. Um, and going to a live concert was an extension of that. And it's really interesting being, a contemporary composer where it's the opposite for the most part, where you listen to music live and the recording is a documentation or an extension of that. So I think it's really interesting to sort of flip the script on that. And last summer, I made a multimedia piece that was, meant to be watched as sort of like a video on your computer. And I'm working on another one that's going to be similar to that right now because of COVID. And I think that that's really made me think a lot about, like, okay, I'm writing primarily music for live performance, but what are some ways in which I can sort of blur those lines, and what are some ways in which I can, like, is there, I think of music technology as an extension of, what we can do. And it allows you to do things, or allows composers to do things that we've never been able to do before, especially because it's so accessible, relatively speaking, nowadays. So COVID has definitely changed the way I think about my practice in that regard, because I feel like I'm not being forced to, but given the opportunity to think about uh, my musical upbringing, or parts of my musical upbringing, in a different light. And then, as far as the Black Lives Matter movement, that's been a really interesting. I mean, I think it's led to a bunch of really interesting conversations in our specific world, because let's not pretend as though classical music in general isn't an overwhelmingly white European male dominated thing. And I think that because of that, there are a lot of small things for composers that I think are not really discussed much, but in terms of like the actual way we write music, there's always been this preference towards, if it's not notated, then you're not composing per se. And I think that that's kind of a ridiculous notion, and that's, in my opinion, rooted in this preference towards the European tradition of music making. And I grew up, I knew how to work in Logic before I knew how to notate music. So it's just like, for me, that is a form of composition to me. And I think that this, we were just also talking with Angelica Negron, and she was talking about how she works in Ableton. I think that's dope, because it's just like, that's a totally different form of music making, where she's talking about sampling an orchestra piece, and it's just like, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is hopefully going to encourage people to interact with different traditions of music making and analyze them from the perspective of, this is an entirely different musical tradition that has been neglected and ignored, especially in academia, that is just as intense and involved as the European classical tradition. So for that reason, it's really, this moment has really forced me to, because I think those two things come together quite a bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I was taking from what you were saying. I mean, I feel like there's so many ways that these two big events kind of inform each other. One is amplified because of I think, because of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's murder happened during COVID. I think that's changed the way the conversation is happening, and so there's so many things coming together for it. I love the way you just put, and it's something that I've thought about, but not to this level, where all of the music you grew up listening to, all the music I grew up listening to, was made in one way and taken in one way, which is a way that we can make and take in music right now.
Yeah.
It's actually just the kind of the side that is very heavily like the kind of classical side of what I'm a part of and what So's a part of. And I think that hit us at this moment too, in terms of plenty of the music we make outside of the way we teach happens in different ways, happens with different people in the recording studio at different times, not in the room together, happens over the ethernet, over the ether, happens sending shit back and forth. Like, some of the producers I work with, it's like, whenever I play drums, I'm not playing with the whole band there. It's a very natural way to make music. But what COVID and quarantine shut down was this classical chamber music side. And at first, I think we too were like, it's all gone. But it's like, oh no, wait, there are most of the world or a lot of the world still makes music in other ways that don't have to do with these kind of Eurocentric ideals. And
I mean,
yeah,
even, sorry, go ahead.
No.
Even an extension of that is, I think that in a lot of ways, this preference towards live music is a great thing in one regard, because in my experience, in my opinion, listening to live music is a very particular experience. And the same way that listening to music in headphones is another very particular experience, and they're both equally valid experiences. But my experience with classical music has been primarily through listening to it through headphones. You know, it's like I've never heard the majority of the pieces that we talk about in, you know, 20th century like contemporary music literature. I've never heard most of these pieces live. I've heard them through headphones.
Right.
So it's just kind of like that doesn't necessarily lessen their impact, but it's just like now I have this opportunity to interact with this music on my terms, whenever I want, wherever I want, in a way that I don't think was possible 40, 50 years ago. And I think that's something that can be embraced. And I think that that's something that we can look at and say, like, there are a lot of really interesting opportunities and possibilities there. And in that regard, it's like studio music has been doing that for a century. So it's like, why should we not do that as well?
Yeah.
So,
And I love that perspective. I'm really down. It's funny. I definitely, in some weird way, I feel like, so this conversation, you are not interviewing me, I am interviewing you, but I'm still going to talk about myself. I apologize. But like, so I've thought my answer to this question has been like, oh shit, like, you know, so it's kind of more and more become a live band is the way I've thought about it. It's like more and more like we've valued the idea that people are coming together to experience something, shared experience. Those ideas have become important values in the music
yeah.
making. And I don't think that means that they don't have to be important values, but it's true. There's been a bit of a pity party for maybe like 1 month longer than there should have been, in terms of like, concerts are gone. You know, that feeling of like, I definitely love the reframing of like the what is possible, and I think, I mean, Soci was one way for us to start to deal with that, and totally grateful that you wrote this piece, and I know that the students were super pumped to work with you on it, and
It was a lot of
we are
fun.
very pumped to present it on Brooklyn Bound. This sounds like I'm wrapping up, but I still have one more question for you, even though that was a perfect wrap up if this was a 4-question podcast. um, you know, the last question I've been asking everybody, does maybe have to do more with the live, maybe it doesn't have to, but have to do more with the live music moment and the idea that, you know, we haven't been on concert stages or seen concerts, that kind of thing. And, you know, I know for um, you know, we kind of have the stories that we share when we're in the van driving from gig to gig of the, like, you know, the moments on stage that were sometimes transcendent, but most often, you know, the terrible shit that happens, you know, the kind of like the shared experiences, you know, they kind of like form a certain bond that we have. As like,
Yeah.
what do you have a memory from, you know, pre-March concert moment? This can be, you know, your high school metal band or your, you know, Peabody last piece that was played, whatever it is, you know, but do you have that kind of moment, that's that you would like to share, of like either fun or transcendent or terrible or whatever it is, a memorable moment?
Yeah. Oof. I think one of the most memorable moments that I've had as a composer, pre-COVID, was that, um, you know, when I was playing in bands and everything like that, like whenever I was hearing music that I wrote played, I was always playing it. You know, it was this, I am the creator of this in multiple regards. Excuse me. And I think, the first time I actually heard somebody else play my music where I wasn't, you know, a part of it, and I just gave them some notated stuff and they played it. That was a really, sort of, um, I guess, life changing experience for me, because I was like, this is awesome. The piece didn't sound very good in retrospect, but I thought it did at the time. But I think like along those lines, I think they're like more than a single moment sticks out to me. I think one of the most gratifying and sort of encouraging and enjoyable moments, that I can think of as a composer, is hearing your music that you've written, hearing it for the first time, and being like, that actually sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Um, like all these thoughts that I've like been having, and all these ideas of what I've had about what this might sound like, and you hear it, and it sounds pretty cool, and you're like, awesome. But on the flip side of that, when you write something and it doesn't sound good, it's just like,
What were all those hours about?
yeah,
Like, was that,
yeah,
man, that's, you know, no, I relate to that in terms of, though, I love the idea that more and more, I imagine at Princeton, I hope more and more the music that you're gonna be writing, like, you know, you get to collaborate with the folks at the same time, because I've had that experience too when I'm just writing something for somebody and you don't get in the room with them, then that moment is so amplified, you know, because it's like the first time you're hearing this stuff. um
yeah,
but for me, that moment that you're describing is more often than not terrifying, because the idea of being the performer playing your music, at least like if it's not going well, you can change some stuff in the moment to try to make it better. You know, you could,
yeah.
play some crazy thing, you know, to try to help the cause, you know. When you're just sitting back, you're like, oh man.
Yeah, yeah. I think I whenever I have, you know, like whenever I'm listening to a new piece of mine, I'm always just sitting in the audience, like gripping the bottom of my chair, just like this is going to be interesting. So like, you know, whenever it goes well, I'm like, yes.
Yeah,
Whenever it doesn't go well, I'm just going to go right home and I'm not going to talk
those are
to
amplified experiences in the, yeah, no,
anybody.
totally. Well, I am pumped. I'm pumped to hear this piece again, October 8th. It's an awesome piece. But I'm pumped to work with you on a new piece.
Yeah, yeah,
Through,
it's going to be a lot of
through
fun.
our PSK, so at Princeton, Elijah at Princeton,
Yeah.
hang. Um, and I have to say, from hanging with you yesterday, um, watch out. Next time I see you on Zoom, I'm gonna have my white Adidas on. So
All right, yeah,
be careful.
I'm gonna hold you to that, as you called yourself yesterday, fast hands truding. So I mean, you know, fast
Wait, that
hands
was very
truding.
facetious. I'm not sure if you heard that. I have the slowest hands in the band. That's what that.
Yeah, I gathered that that was, you know, a joke, but
Okay.
I think that that's the best nickname anybody could ever give themselves. So I'm definitely gonna. That's if there's one thing that I'll remember you for the rest of my life, it's going to be that nickname.
All right, killer. I'm
So
gonna go with Gravity Blast Smith.
there we
Does
go.
that work?
Yeah, I mean, for full disclaimer, I can't do them myself because I'm not a
Got it.
percussionist or a drummer, but you know, we can make people think that I am for the
The
sake of this
drummer in
conversation.
your band could do Gravity Blast. Is that the
Hmm. Yeah.
awesome? Well, thanks for having this conversation, man. It's really
Yeah, it's
great.
been great. Yeah.
And
All right.
we'll see you. Hopefully, we'll see you on the chat in October. That's been
Yeah.
the one weird and cool thing about these shows is that folks can get in and kind of share what they're feeling in real time, which is really nice. So, see you
Yeah.
online in a
All
couple
right.
weeks. All right,
All right. Take it
take it
easy.
easy, Elijah.